So Niall Ferguson, he's one of the most pro-West historians who loves the British Empire, now wonders, are we the baddies? In his latest piece for the Free Press. This is Bari Weiss's organization that she has out there, and she wrote a little prologue to Niall's piece saying, I know you might think that he's some kind of a big old establishment hack, but no, he's not. He's really not. Now, he's not a sheep. He instead is actually thinking outside the box. Although Niall was one who wrote a piece in The Independent, really championing the accomplishments of the British Empire, saying, yeah, it's right to ask questions about whether or not the empire was better than the realistically available alternatives. But he says, but you know what? The final analysis, the empire was the force for good and need only consider one question. Would the world have been better off if the British had lacked an empire in 1940? For without the empire, let there be no doubt, the Churchillian strategy of defying Hitler and his allies would have stood a much smaller chance of success. So he's a guy who has defended the British Empire against all accusations time and time again. But now he writes this piece and basically asks, are we the baddies? He asks very specifically, it's titled, We're All Soviets Now. The main question being, with our foreign policy that we've got going on here in the United States, are we now just like the Soviets were during the Cold War? Now, the Soviets, he says the Soviets had a very high infant mortality. There was this idea that they had a booming economy when in reality it was kind of crumbling behind the curtain. He also says that during the Cold War that led to the end of the Soviet Union, he says that the Soviets, they touted themselves as having the vaunted military, a much vaunted military that could not defeat anybody, right? Or that could defeat everybody, that they were this amazing military and mighty military. And that's what they were spending all of their money on. And here we are now doing the same thing. He says that the U.S. Deficit forecasts by the Congressional Budget Office are to exceed 5% of GDP for the foreseeable future and rise to 8.5% by 2054. Economists keep promising us a productivity miracle from most recently AI, but the annual average growth rate of productivity in the U.S. non-farm business sector has been stuck at 1.5% since 2007. We have a military that is simultaneously expensive and unequal to the task it confronts. Soviet leaders said until the bitter end that the Red Army was the biggest and therefore most lethal military in the world. On paper, the U.S. defense budget does indeed exceed those of all other members of NATO put together, but what does the defense budget actually buy us? The current direction of U.S. foreign policy is to egg on others to fight our adversaries as proxies without supplying them with sufficient weaponry to stand much of a chance of winning. This strategy, most visible in Ukraine, makes some sense for the United States, which discovered in the global war on terror that the military could not even defeat a ragtag Taliban after 20 years of effort. Sound familiar? A mighty military, the best in the world, the biggest and the best in the world that can't beat anybody in Afghanistan. So he says, in the Soviet Union, the great lies were that the party and the state existed to serve the interests of the workers and the peasants, and that the United States and its allies were imperialists, little better than the Nazis had been in the Great Patriotic War. The equivalent falsehoods in late Soviet America are that the institutions controlled by the Democratic Party, the federal bureaucracy, the universities, the major foundations, and most of the big corporations are devoted to advancing hitherto marginalized racial and sexual minorities, and that the principal goals of U.S. foreign policy are to combat climate change and to help other countries defend themselves and gain democracy, of course, without sending U.S. troops to war. So he paints this picture. Now, here is one of the most staunch establishment defenders, and he's now even flipping it. I think that even though I may agree or disagree with some of the points that he made in his piece, the interesting overall takeaway from the fact that he even wrote the piece is the fact that he even wrote the piece. That is, we're starting to see the dominoes fall. The establishment is starting to look around and say, is this really working? It doesn't really seem like it's working. Nothing we've done. When was the last time we won a war? What is this strategy of giving all of the weapons to Ukraine and having them fight to the death with Russia, and they are just dying, and we're not encouraging any sort of peace. I mean, are we the baddies? He says at one point in the piece, he says, yeah, you might think that this is kind of comical, right? That I'm comparing us to the Soviet Union, but he's like, but really stop and think about it. That we might actually be. And he says, I first pointed out that we're in a Cold War back in 2018 in the articles for the New York Times and the National Review. I tried to show how the People's Republic of China. So he's saying China, we're in the Cold War with China now. So it used to be the Soviets and the America, and now it's America and China. But rather than we being the Americans and the Soviets being the Soviets, China's now America and the United States is now the Soviets in this. He says the People's Republic of China now occupies the space vacated by the Soviet Union when it collapsed in 1991. This view is less controversial now than it was then. China is clearly not only an ideological rival firmly committed to Marxist-Leninism and one-party rule, it is also a technological competitor, the only one the U.S. confronts in fields such as artificial intelligence and quantum computing. It's a military rival with a navy that is already larger than ours and a nuclear arsenal that is catching up fast. And it's a geopolitical rival, asserting itself not only in the Indo-Pacific, but also through proxies in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. But it only recently struck me that in this new Cold War, we, and not the Chinese, might be the Soviets. It's a bit like that moment when the British comedians David Mitchell and Robert Webb, playing Waffen SS officers toward the end of World War II, asked the immortal question, are we the baddies? I imagine two American sailors asking themselves one day, perhaps as their aircraft carrier is sinking beneath their feet somewhere near the Taiwan Strait, are we the Soviets? So, yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that here we are. We have what the Soviets failed at was they put all of their money in the Cold War. They built up their military. They were spending all of their money on this while their economy and their people were suffering. And they were ignoring that, and they were focused just on the mighty military. Now, the United States at that same time was industrializing. We were making a lot of products. So not only were we focused on the Cold War and building up a mighty military, but we were also still simultaneously, at least, we were doing a lot of industrial. It was during we were making stuff, we were exporting stuff, we were doing a lot of stuff that China is now doing. So we're seeing China build up their military. They now have a navy larger than the United States. That tells you something right there. Also, by the way, the fact that their navy is now larger than the United States, the fact that they're catching up when it comes to their nuclear arsenal. They will soon have as much, if not more than us. But the Navy alone, what makes us think that we're going to be able to cruise on over to Taiwan, which is just right off the coast of China, and we're going to be able to take it from China? We're going to be able to defend it from China when China has a larger Navy? I mean, our Navy's spread out. Theirs is not. They don't have bases all around the world. They're pretty consolidated to defending their nation. So they will be there defending their nation with their mighty Navy, much mightier than ours. And they have every ideological reason to not allow us to win a piece of land right off of their shore. They're just not going to, filled with Chinese people, by the way, who speak Chinese. They're not going to allow that. But here we are thinking that we can compete rather than actually focusing on building up our population, building up our people, building up the infrastructure in our own country. It is time for the United States to focus on itself and not focus on trying to outmatch and strong arm all of these other countries around the world. It won't be the end of the world if we are not the world leader in global terror. That's what first came to my mind. But if we're not the leader in the military, in having this great mighty military, it would not, and being the world, the biggest, most powerful nation, we don't need that. We don't actually need to be that. Plenty of nations are extremely successful. And look at the Nordic region. Look at Scandinavia. Extremely wealthy, well cared for, happy people. And they gave up being Vikings. They just said, you know what, let's put it to rest. We don't need to be Vikings anymore. Let's move on and actually focus on ourselves instead of going around conquering all over the place. And they're perfectly happy and they're not at risk and everything's fine. I mean, minus the fact that they've got some globalists who've gone and, taken and become in charge lately and might be changing some things around, but they enjoyed a good streak. And I'd hope that we could enjoy a similar streak. Thank you for watching this clip from the full Kim Iversen show, which you could catch just by heading to that link down below, KimIversonShow.com. You can watch the full show from what you just watched, or you can catch the full show live Monday through Friday, live streams. 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern at KimIversonShow.com. See you then. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Never miss an episode. Never miss a clip. Never miss a segment. Thanks, guys.